night. There was a bit of a technical difficulty on my end. So I'm glad that we had someone jump in and sub, but I will be with you for the remaining 7 lessons of this course. So I'm going to start out tonight by introducing myself. Then I'm going to review a few things that you learned last night, and then we will jump into the new material. So I'm glad you guys are all here. As always, be vocal in the Q&A if you're curious about anything. Occasionally I'll answer questions as we go, but normally I'll just wait till the end of the class and then address them all. But definitely pop in questions as they come up. So I'll start by introducing myself. So my name is Deandra Ryan Moss. I first started programming at the age of 14 in an attempt to create the coolest MySpace profile that I possibly could, and probably failed at that task, but did succeed at learning a thing or two. And then I took a little break from it for a while and got back into programming in college, where I worked doing some very mathy stuff, some analysis of higher order differential equations. I switched focus after college, went to a web development boot camp myself, and then ended up working in the industry on a data aggregation project, because no matter what I do, I cannot stay away from data. And all throughout this, I was teaching and tutoring a little bit on the side, and I've always really enjoyed teaching, especially technical topics. So about 6 months ago, I transitioned out of being a software developer into being a teacher. So here I am teaching you guys all of my wisdom, and you guys can learn from what I've learned, learn from some of my mistakes, and we get to go through this journey together. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit more about what we'll be learning tonight and what you'll go on to learn in the Lambda main curriculum if you choose to continue on with that. So as I'm sure they went over last night, this introduction to web development course covers some of the front-end web development topics. So last night we talked a little high level, and then you learned some HTML. Tonight we will be learning more HTML and diving into CSS. So we'll be doing a lot of the design-oriented stuff tonight, HTML and CSS. And those are 2 really critical languages in web development. And the other language that is absolutely key to web development is JavaScript. So starting tomorrow and throughout the rest of the course, we'll be focusing solely on JavaScript. So you'll come away from this 8-night course with some really important fundamentals for web development. Of course, there are a ton of fun things that we unfortunately cannot cover in just 2 weeks. And that's what the main curriculum of Lambda School is for. So I know a lot of you guys are here because you're interested in attending the Lambda School main curriculum. Some of you guys have perhaps already been accepted in the Lambda School main curriculum. Some of you guys might just be here because you want to learn some basic programming, and that's totally cool too. But I'm going to talk a bit about what we do at Lambda School. So in the Lambda School main curriculum, it is a 6-month immersive course for learning web development and computer science. So we take people who are either beginners or have experience in other languages, or maybe have some web development experience but not quite enough to get hired, and we ramp you up all the way to the point where you are ready to jump in to a full-time industry grade position. So we're taking you basically from 0 to the job. So we, of course, teach you all sorts of cool topics over the course of 6 months. It is a full-time course, so we are giving you all sorts of amazing topics, just like one after the other. So we will go into great detail in everything you see in this course. So that's front-end web development. We're going to really unpack that in detail in the main curriculum. We'll then go into back-end web development, which is also JavaScript-oriented, but a little more databases and the things that you can't necessarily see. And then, speaking of C, we go into some computer science topics, such as the language C, which is an object-oriented language, and Python. We do some data projects in Python. So you come away from the Lambda School curriculum with a really well-rounded education, with tons of practical web development skills, as well as some of the more algorithmy, computer science-y skills behind that. And then once you're done with the course, we and the hiring team will help you get out there and get your job. And in fact, we are so confident that you are going to come away from Lambda School ready to be hired that we actually do not require you to pay anything upfront. So we have what's called a de-risked education model, which means you can pay 0 upfront. And instead of paying your tuition upfront, you can pay it back over the course of your first 2 years on the job. So practically what that means is if you don't get hired, we don't get paid. So there is no risk of you going through and not getting a job and owing us a bunch of money. You only pay your tuition once you have a full-time computer science or software development job. So that is the Lambda School main curriculum. If you are interested in applying and feel like you're ready to start that process, reach out to Karen Zachary in Slack. And even if you're not quite ready and have some questions, she is a great person to talk to. So reach out to her for all admissions related questions. So that is enough of my spiel about Lambda School. I know you guys are excited to get to learning some more front-end web development tonight. So we're going to do a brief HTML review, and then we will dive into CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we will start doing some coding. All right. So up here, I have a little web page pulled up. So this is kind of my basic HTML, CSS, JavaScript go-to example. And it's a really good example for illustrating on a basic page what the difference between the three languages we're working with are. So I'm really, for right now, just going to focus on the difference between HTML and CSS. So you talked about that some last night, but I'm just going to go over it one more time. So the difference between HTML and CSS is that HTML renders items on the screen. So HTML is all about what goes on the screen. CSS is about style. How does the stuff on the screen look? So let's go ahead and take a look at this example to illustrate that in detail. So notice that there is a header up here, there is a paragraph, there's a button below it, there's a box that all of these things are contained in. That's all HTML. Those are all the elements on the screen. CSS gives them their style. So for example, we can see that our box is all blue and that our header is in this stylized font, and even that there is some white space around our box. That's all style. So none of those things are the elements, that's just the way the elements are styled, and that is all accomplished using CSS. Just to illustrate the point a little further, I'm going to go ahead and pop open a code base to show you what's going on behind the scenes. So in this course, we won't really be working with code bases directly. We'll be doing everything in CodePen, which makes life a little easier at the start. But it's nice to see an example of a code base because this is more the kind of thing you'll work with on the job and in the Lambda School main curriculum. So we have an HTML file here, which once again indicates everything that goes on the screen. And then over here we have a style page, which is going to show us everything, how everything is styled. So now I don't expect you to understand exactly how to read this CSS code yet, though by the end of tonight, you'll understand exactly what's going on here. In this HTML file, however, some of these elements should look familiar from what you learned last night. So we can see just by looking at these two files, without even really understanding the code itself, that they're clearly different languages. Different languages, just from a straight up visual standpoint, look different. We can see that there are curly brackets here. There's kind of this pattern where we see something in red and then curly brackets and some pairs. Once again, that pattern is going to make a lot of sense in just a minute here. But for now, we can just kind of visually see that there's one thing going on in our CSS file, but over here in our HTML file, it looks totally different. We have these, as you know, elements in these brackets. They're kind of nested together. And then there's text. You wouldn't ever really see text in a CSS file, as in content, because CSS doesn't determine the content on the page. However, all the content that's rendered up here is going to appear in our HTML file. So just from a visual perspective, we can see that the two languages are totally different. And I see actually a question I'm going to answer right now, which is, what is a code base? So a code base is just a collection of files that work together to accomplish some sort of goal. So for example, if you were to do something really advanced, like create an artificial intelligence chess player or create an advanced web application, you might have hundreds of files, thousands of files all together working to accomplish that end. In this case, we just have 3 files, and all they do is create this simple web page that I've showed you up here. So once again, a code base is a collection of code, sometimes often in totally different languages, that all interact together to accomplish some goal. And in fact, that leads really nicely into my next point, which is this idea of how do these files talk to each other? So HTML, which you went over a bit last night, is read directly by the browser. If you opened an HTML file just in Chrome or Safari or whichever browser you use, it would be read and displayed perfectly because browsers are designed to read HTML. CSS is a little different. You can't just open a CSS page with the browser. You have to actually tell the files in your code base to communicate. So once again, this piece that I'm sharing right now isn't something that you'll need to know in this course, but it's a really good thing to keep in mind moving forward as a programmer, is this idea that the code needs to talk to each other. So I'll show you exactly in our code base where that's happening. Notice that there's a piece of code here that actually links in the style sheet. And once again, this isn't something you'll need to know the syntax of or memorize unless you want to play with some stuff outside of class, but it's something you will need to know moving forward. The most important takeaway is just to realize that in order for files to work together, we need some bit of code that tells them to communicate. In this case, this line inside of our HTML file that tells it to look for a styles.css page and apply it. So fortunately, we'll get to short circuit that step moving forward because we're using CodePen, which takes care of all of that for us. So on that note, let me bust open CodePen so that we can take the shortcut route and write some HTML and CSS directly into our browser. So here is CodePen. You guys saw CodePen in the lesson last night and used CodePen for the homework last night as well. So once again, tonight we will be coding in CodePen during the lesson, and you will have some CodePen homework to complete tonight. So CodePen is a sandbox environment. Think of it as an easy way to write small amounts of code. So a couple circumstances where you would use a sandbox environment like CodePen would be, for example, if you're just starting to learn the language and you just want to write a few simple things and have them appear immediately on the page, like in this class, perfect tool for that. If in the job down the line, you just had a couple things you wanted to try out just to see how they'd work before you plugged them into your application or web page or whatever you're working on, you might bust open CodePen just to experiment with some things really quickly. However, CodePen is not ideal for a big project or big web application. As you saw in that little code base example, you want to keep the files separate so you can keep them organized. So if you have something that has hundreds of thousands of lines of code, CodePen would not be a good tool for that. So as you move forward and build bigger projects in the main curriculum and then even bigger projects out in the industry, you won't use CodePen as much, but it's a great way to start because it automatically renders the code that we write on the screen in real time, which is really convenient. So that is a little reminder of what CodePen is and why we're using it in this class. Let's go ahead and actually take advantage of it so we can do a review of some of the HTML that you learned last night and then learn a few more HTML elements. So as a review of the term elements, it's really the key building block of any web page. Is you can think of web pages as being these kind of nested blocks inside of each other. So in this web page, we start out with a div. So we can think of a div as a big container to put like items together. So this little green box here, everything inside of that is our div. So the div is kind of an invisible box where we put other related items. So inside of our div, we can see that we have some other items here, such as a header, a smaller header, a paragraph, and that paragraph contains a couple of span elements. If we want to see those over in the page, we can see they're in little pink boxes. So as a review of what all these elements do, divs are big containers. Headers are just headers. There are 6 of them, H1 through 6. And think of H1 as being the most important, H6 as being the least important, and so forth. And by default, the H1 will render as the largest, and H2 is the next largest, and so forth. But we're going to talk about why we don't really want to think about things in terms of size, because this, for example, the size of our H1 is a default size, but we can always overwrite using CSS. So when you think about sizing items, even though there's some defaults that appear in HTML, you really want to use CSS to actually create your styling and your sizing. So we have a couple headers. A paragraph is exactly what it sounds like. It's for a little bit more text. And then a span is a way to, if you want to highlight an individual word or an individual block of text. A span is good for a little container that might go inline, so inside of a paragraph or inside of a list or something like that. A couple other things to note about these are that divs and spans by default are actually invisible. I've thrown a little bit of CSS code in here, which I'm going to delete right now. So we can see that by default, that div, even though that box is there, is invisible. And there are spans here too around this word and this word, but they're invisible by default. So when we're just doing HTML, sometimes it seems a little weird that we would use these invisible elements. But once we throw CSS into the picture, they become really useful because we can start to put borders around them or colors around them or move them around the screen. So these default invisible elements are still really useful because now that we've grouped everything together, we can style it all together. So I think a lot of the puzzle pieces that maybe seemed a little confusing last night will start to come together once we throw this other critical piece of CSS into the mix. Before we get to CSS though, let's go over a few more things with HTML. So the last thing I want to review is the syntax of HTML. So there's a nice pattern to how we write HTML. We always start with what's called an opening tag. That's two of these little caret brackets, and inside of them we put our tag name. So these tag names are things that are actually built into the HTML language. That means that we can't just come up with any tag name we feel like. We actually have to know which tag names are legal, which ones are built into the language, and those are the only ones we can use. Fortunately, there is a giant list of them online. And even more fortunately, we're only going to deal with a few of them tonight. So just be aware that if you want to learn more HTML tags, or if you forgot exactly which ones to use, you can always Google them. I recommend MDN, which is Mozilla's documentation, as a great place to look for basic references for HTML and CSS. That's the site I'm on right here. So you have an opening bracket, or an opening tag, which contains two brackets and a tag name. Inside of that, you have the contents, which in the case of this header is just text, and then you follow that by a closing bracket. So that is the pattern of almost everything in HTML. We open our tag, we put content in it, we close our tag. And as we can see with the div, content can be pretty complex. The content of this div, for example, is all these other elements. But notice it still follows that pattern of we open our div, we put all the stuff inside it, and then we close our div. We want to make sure that everything that's supposed to go inside of the div comes between the opening tag and the closing tag. So that little formula of open tag, content, close tag is like the key thing to know with HTML. Once you have that mastered, the rest is kind of just details. So we've looked at these 4 basic elements. Well, technically more than 4 since there are actually 6 headers, but you get my drift. Let's learn a couple more slightly advanced ones that will help you make your pages even more interesting. So I'm going to create another div down here, and we'll throw some more HTML elements in here. So I'm going to start by giving you guys a link. So let's say we wanted a link to the Lambda School webpage. So the tag for a link is actually called an anchor. And the syntax for that is just an A. So once again, you couldn't actually write out anchor because that's not built into the language. It has to be an A. So if we go ahead and write Lambda School inside of our A tag, we can see it pops up on screen. However, you might notice that it's really not a link yet. We've at no point told the A tag where it should link you to, and if I try to click over here, nothing's going to happen. And that's why I say that a anchor tag is a little more advanced than what we've seen so far. So it's slightly more advanced because it doesn't work until we have something called an attribute. So it turns out that there are something called an attribute that you can put in your tags. Some of these are optional, some of these are required. For example, with the anchor tag, it's required that you have your href or else you won't be able to actually write or create a link. So an href is the attribute that we use on an anchor tag. So notice that our syntax here is it goes inside the opening tag, we write out href equals, and then we put quotes over here. So that is the basic syntax for an attribute. And as we see a couple more, you'll start to see the pattern. So let's go ahead and throw a link in here. So I'm going to copy the Lambda School website, put that in here, and we notice that by default, this just lit up and underlined, which is kind of our cue that our link might be working. So I click it, and we are redirected. Unfortunately, links are a little weird inside of CodePen. So one thing I like to do to make life a little easier is throw in a second attribute. So you can have more than one attribute. So this one is called target, and I'm going to set it equal to something called underscore blank. So this is something that is built into the language, and you will see this a lot as you go along. The attribute target set to the value of underscore blank, and it is critical that you have this underscore in here. This tells the anchor tag, open my link in a new window. Here you go. So as you're surfing the web the next few days, I encourage you to take a look at the links you click and notice that sometimes they will actually fully redirect you. Sometimes they will pop open a new window. Now you know what's happening behind the scenes when that happens. It means that there's either a target attribute or there isn't. That is how you get your link to open in a new window. So there's a little introduction to attributes, and I've taught you two of them, which can help you create links. So let me show you another tag that will that also utilizes an attribute. This is our image tag. Once again, it's really important that we know exactly what the tag name is. Notice that it's not the full word image, it's img. That's what we have to use to create an image. And so automatically I've created this opening and closing tag. And right, that's kind of the pattern we've seen, opening tag, closing tag. But I'm gonna break the rules on you for just a minute. It turns out that with images, we don't need a closing tag. There are some elements in HTML which are self-closing, and images are one. You can think of an image as being self-closing because you can't really put anything inside an image. An image is just an image. So we just self-close it by putting the slash on the back of it. So once again, we can see that I've created an image tag, but nothing's happened. There's no image. That's because we need an attribute. The attribute for images is called source, SRC. So I promise you that as a new developer, you are going to be mixing up href and source about 80 times. Don't worry about it. Everyone does it. Just use the documentation if you can't remember which one goes with which. And then next thing you know, you'll be doing it in your sleep. So href, image, source. So just like href, source is going to be a URL. You could also use if you were in a code base, the actual location in the file source of the image. So in a production app, for example, you wouldn't want to be linking in some third-party image because then if the third party took down the image, your app would be broken. But for the work you'll be doing in this intro to web development course, it's totally fine to just find images online, copy their URL, and plug them in. So I have this image that I've plugged in, and we can see that it pops up here. So I have successfully created an image using the attribute of source. So there you have it. And make sure it's the actual URL of the image. So for example, if you, let me find a good example. Here we go. So this is actually the, if you right click on an image, you'll see copy image address. That's the URL you want to get. Otherwise, your image might not work. So make sure when you're finding images in the homework tonight that you actually right click them and grab the actual image address. And that is what you can plug in to your source so that you get an image popped up here. So I'm going to actually delete this image just because sometimes it will keep reloading it and lag out the class, and we don't want that. So sorry, I'm going to get rid of our image, and then we'll move on to the next things. So the last elements I want to show you are lists. And lists don't use attributes, but they're a little weird because you actually need multiple elements to build them. So an image just requires one tag, a header just requires one tag. Everything we've seen so far just requires one tag. But lists require actually multiple tags to build. So let me show you. So let's say we wanted a list of fruit. So I'll create a little header that says fruits. Headers are not required for lists, but can be useful so you know what your list is of. So a list of fruits would be an unordered list. So we want to use UL, which stands for unordered list. And that's our way of telling HTML or telling the computer that we are about to start a list. So notice that nothing's appeared so far. To actually create items on our list, we want to use a tag called LI, which stands for list item. And by default, in unordered lists, these items will have bullet points. So we could do watermelon, mango, jackfruit, avocados are technically fruits, etc. So now we've created ourselves a list of fruits. So notice that we use two different tags, the UL to start and finish our list, along with all the list items. So if we were to get rid of our UL, these elements would still appear, but notice that some of the styling has kind of disappeared. So weird things will go wrong if you just do list items by themselves. So I would not try that. You don't want to add any more chaos into your code than is necessary when you're first learning to code. So that is one example of a list. We might also have an ordered list. So let's say that I was putting together my to-do list, and I want to put it in order because I want to rank the most important thing I have to do first. So now we're going to start with an OL. As you might guess, OL stands for ordered list. And then we will still use our list items within this list. So the list items are the same. The UL and the OL is what changes between our ordered and unordered list. So the first thing I have to do is teach you guys some coding. The next thing I will do tonight is answer questions at the end of the course. My brother is actually coming into town to visit me tonight, so then I will give my brother a tour of Bisbee, which is where I live, and then maybe after that we'll have dinner. So that is my to-do list for tonight. So these are now in order because it's actually in order of what I'm going to do them. And notice that the ordered list defaults to numbers instead of bullet points. I'll be honest, in the real world of coding, pretty much the first thing you do is get rid of these bullets and these numbers so that you can control the styling that's going on. But it's a nice thing to know that there's these default styles, and it'll help you remember which list you're working with. So those are the last HTML elements I am going to teach you guys. They will provide plenty of opportunity to build web pages and practice these skills. If you are hankering for a challenge, as I showed you earlier, you could go to the MDN docs and look at all these different HTML elements you could use. So you can play with any of these that you want, but I would recommend trying to master the ones that we've taught before you play around with any others. And you can see that P and OL is here. You can also see a lot that you've probably never heard of. Honestly, there are some on here I've never heard of. There are a lot, and many of them are not used very often. But just know they're there. And one thing that I always say, especially to new developers, is the documentation is your friend. Googling is a really big part of what goes on when you are a professional web developer, so start early. There's sometimes this misconception early on that you should have as much as possible memorized. You'll memorize the things you use a lot automatically, but everything else, just look it up. There's really no need to have every single thing that's out there memorized because there is a ton out there and it's really well documented. So Google and read the docs, and don't spend too much time floundering trying to remember if it's IG or IMG or IMAGE. Just look it up and you'll be able to figure it out pretty quickly. So that's my little plug for the docs. You'll hear me plugging documentation again many, many times before our 2 weeks are up. All right, so we have a nice little web page all full of HTML, but apart from a little bit of that CSS that I briefly showed you at the beginning, it's not really styled. So let's talk about how to style pages and how to use CSS. So I'm going to actually clear out what I have so far and start you guys fresh. So when you're thinking about CSS code, there are really 3 ingredients to any line of CSS. Something called a selector, something called a property, and then a value. So let me show you real quick. Let's say that we wanted to make all of the spans on the page have the text color of purple. So here is what our code would look like. And notice, maybe actually I'll do pink because the purple is a little subtle. Okay, so we can see that those have just turned pink. So what did I do here? The recipe is selector, selector property value. So the selector is all about what do we want to style? What on the page do we want to style? And for starters, we're just going to be selecting elements. So when I write span out, I'm saying I want to style all of the spans on the page. So when I select span, I'm saying every single span. In this case, it's just 2 of them. But if there were 80 spans, we'd be styling all 80 of them. So that is what this selector means. After we've selected, we put a pair of curly brackets down. So notice that we're now using a different style of brackets than we were in HTML. That's just a syntax difference in CSS. And then we normally do our pairs on new lines. And I'm not sure if it was mentioned last night, but in almost all languages, white space is optional. So we could smash all our code together onto one line and it would still work. It just becomes a lot less readable. So we want to use tabs and spaces in new lines. You want to look at the way that I'm writing the code or look at examples online and follow that same white space pattern, because otherwise you won't be able to read your code, your fellow developers won't be able to read your code, you'll make bad habits. So do the white space and the indenting. Trust me, it'll make life a lot easier. So we do curly brackets, and then on a new line, we have a pair of items. So this is called the property. So that's saying, okay, these are the elements we want to style. What do we want to style about them? And in this case, I'm saying color, which means text color. And so these properties are going to be actually built into the language. So kind of like the tags, they're things that are built in. We can't, if we tried to do something like text color, which might make sense to us, notice that our styling just broke. That's because text color doesn't exist in CSS. The name for it is color. So we have to know what property we want, and then we can put a value. So the values, there's a little more wiggle room in what we put as our value, but we can't just put anything. So if we put down stormy blue, it doesn't know what stormy blue is. But if we put down dark blue, it knows that color. I think it knows hot pink. Yep. So there are lots of colors that are just built into the language. So for starters, it's really good to just kind of pick these either primary or variation of primary colors that you can just type out. If you want to actually specifically pick your color, that's an option too. You can use the hex code for any color you want. I'm not really going to go over that, but if you want to play around with it in the homework, just Google hex code and you just need a hashtag followed by digits. So something like hashtag, I have no idea what color this is going to be. Maybe that's not even a real hex color. I'm failing to make up a hex color on this spot, but Google a hex picker and you'll be able to find whatever color you want, or just type in something like pink or red or green or whatever, and it will know what you're talking about. So this is saying I want to style the text color, and this is saying this is the color I want to style it. And that really is the pattern for all of CSS. We select something and then we put in these pairs of, okay, I want to do this, style this attribute and give it this value. So let's look at a couple other things we can do apart from text color. So we could also do height. Actually, height is not going to look very good on this span. So let me do it over here. So now I'm going to grab my divs and I'll do a height of 600 pixels. So notice that my divs just got really big all of a sudden. That's because I just changed the height. And let's go ahead and actually add a background color too. That'll make it easier to see what's going on. So I'll do background color of blue. Oh no, that's horrible. Let's do background color of light blue. That's a little less blinding. So now we can see a little more clearly where our divs are. So background color is another possible property. And then we see that quite similar to color, we have these color values that we can put in. Height tells us how high we want our elements, and then we can follow that by a pixel count. There are some other options for different things we can put into height. I would encourage you to Google the height attribute if you want to see some examples. We can do a border. So borders are a little different. So notice that I actually put in 3 values for the border. I started out with the width, and then the style, and then the color. So this could be something like dashed or dotted. There are a bunch of options for styles. And now that we've put the border in, we can actually see a little more clearly now that we have 1 and 2 divs. So before it just was kind of this smorgasbord of divs all stuck together. But now that we have a border, we can see that there are actually 2. And this height of 300 is a little more obvious. Let's throw in a width as well. How about 100 pixels? So now all of a sudden, everything is really smashed in because, and now it's off the page. If we do 500, that's a little more readable. So we can actually adjust the size of our elements. By default, a div is going to take up the entire width of the screen and be exactly as high as the content in it. But if we want to move that around, we're totally welcome to with CSS. So we can see that these are a few examples. So let's go down to border and talk about that in a little more detail. I actually have the docs for that popped up here somewhere. Oh, here's a giant list of CSS properties you might use. Once again, you are not expected to know or memorize all of these ever. Just know the ones that you use a lot and then look them up as much as you want to because documentation is your friend. Here's height. We can see pixels like I did. There's also a unit of measurement called ems, which is a little more relative to the actual size of the window. There you can do a percentage. You can set it to auto. I would encourage you to play around with these if you're bored or have extra time after the homework. Let's do border now. So border, we can see that there are several different options for how we can do border. If we wanted to, we could just do the style. So I could just have said solid, and it would actually default to being black. And I think the pixel default is slightly bigger. I think it might be 5 or 3 or something. Sorry, don't know offhand. Documentation. So we can just do the style, or if we want to make it thinner or make it red, we can always customize that. So there are different options for the types of values you can put in those. The biggest takeaway is that there's a lot of flexibility in these, and you don't need to know every possible way to do it. You just need to know at least one right way. So either rewatch this video or take a look at the docs. There's tons of examples online, tons of videos on YouTube, places where you can see the right way to do these. And it really is particular. If you get the order wrong, or if you spell this wrong, or if, like I showed you, you did text color instead of color, your code's gonna break because it has to be precisely to the specifications that CSS is expecting. So let me get rid of this height because it's kind of annoying. Okay, what else do I want to show you? Let's do font size. So I mentioned at the beginning here that this idea that an H1 is the biggest header is a default, and you don't want to get too attached to that idea because once you get into CSS, all bets are off. So let's say that I don't want my H1s to be big. I could go in and use the font size attribute and make it tiny if I wanted to. So now my header is almost unreadably small. Probably not good for a functional, user-friendly web page, but definitely illustrates the point that those default sizes on the headers are only defaults. And once you go in with CSS, anything goes. So we can use font size on headers. We could use font size to make our paragraphs larger. Let's do. Uh-oh, why is that not working? Oh, because I forgot the dash. Yes, so don't forget the dash and font size or it won't work. So notice that that paragraph just got a little bigger and a little bigger. So there you go. That is how you can actually go in and change the styling on all your code. As you can see with my example up here, we have learned just enough CSS here to make your page look like it is from the late 90s. Unfortunately, it takes a little bit of mastering before you get to the point where you can actually make really beautiful websites. And I think that CSS is actually one of the most subtle skills out there. I will admit I am not the most excellent CSSer, and I have tons of respect for people who can just make those beautiful web pages. It is not a skill to be underestimated. But for now, just revel in the glory of your, early 90s or late 90s, early 2000s looking websites, because that'll give you a chance to really play around with these and learn the basics. So a couple other things I want to show you is I want to talk about something called the box model. So as you might have noticed, my two divs are just kind of smashed together. The only reason we can even tell that there are two divs is because of our border. And so that's not very pretty. Another thing you might have noticed is that all my text is squished up against the sides. Look, the F on fruits is like right up against the edge and on to do, and it looks pretty bad. So that is where the box model comes into play. So let me bust open this picture. So every single HTML element you can think about in terms of the box model. There's something called the margin, which represents the space outside of it. If we look at this very early example, this here would be the margin. Notice that there's space on the sides outside of my div. That's the margin. The next thing we have is the border. The border kind of speaks for itself. We saw how we can adjust the width of that. We can see on this that there is just a little thin border around our div. The next thing we have is the padding. That is the space inside of our element, but between the border and the content. So you can see that the padding goes around the content, but inside the border. So in this example, we see that there is some space at the top, some space on the side. There is space all around. So this is a page that is utilizing the box model nicely. The things I just pointed out over here that make this page extra ugly is that we are not. There's no padding, there's no margin. There's a little bit of margin over here that appears by default, but in between these two, no margin. We can fix that though. There are attributes for that. So we can do margin, and let's do this in pixels. So we'll do 20 pixels. And now notice that all of my divs have this 20 pixels around them, which makes them easy to see that there are two. It makes them just in general a lot easier to look at. And if we want to deal with this stuff squished inside issue, we would do padding. And ta-da, this thing just with 2 lines of code all of a sudden looks way better. So margin and padding and the box model at large are kind of the unsung heroes of CSS. They're not the most obvious things, and they're easy to not think about as just a web user, but they are like the cornerstones of what makes websites look good and be readable. So you definitely want to play with margins and padding. Like step 1 to making something look better is just add some margin and padding. And so when you're thinking about how much space your element actually takes up, you can't just think about the height and the width on its own, because there's also border and padding outside. So all these things are important to consider when you're trying to figure out how much space on the page an item will take up. So that is the box model for you. All right, well, that is all of the properties I am going to teach you for tonight. Let me actually just answer one little question about the box model just to clarify you. So the box model just refers to this idea that every element potentially has, you could think of every element as having margin even if it's 0. So every element is made up of margin followed by border, followed by padding, followed by content. So it's just a way of thinking about, of kind of partitioning off the each element on the screen. It's a good way of conceptualizing that. So that's what the box model refers to. And if you just Google box model, you can find this, probably this image and a bunch of other similar images. All right, so that is all of the specific properties I'm going to teach you. But we do have a little bit more to learn tonight. I want to talk a little bit more about selectors. So you might have noticed that the selectors I've been using are not very sophisticated. So when I did div, it styled both divs. When I did span, it styled both spans, etc., etc. So that's not a very sophisticated way to build a web page. For example, as you hopefully saw last night when you played around in the inspector, web pages tend to consist of like a bajillion divs. It's like divs inside of divs inside of divs inside of divs. If you had to style all of the divs exactly the same, you would be in trouble. There would be no way to ever build a good-looking website. So this tool I taught you for just grabbing a specific element and styling it, great to start, sometimes useful, not the most sophisticated. So let me show you a few slightly more sophisticated ways to select and style elements. So let's start with this question. What if we wanted to style just one element on the screen? Let's say that we wanted to style our avocado green. So we couldn't grab the list items. I'll start by showing you what not to do. So if I just did list item, color green, that would style all 6 of the list items on the page. That's not what we want. We just want one. So clearly this selector is not going to work. What we need is something called an ID. An ID is something we can add to our HTML code to actually ID a single item. So IDs are specifically used to style one single solitary item. Like, for example, the list item that says avocado. So if I want to put an ID on this, I actually put it on as an attribute, just like we did with href or source. So I do an attribute called ID, set equal to these quotes, and in this I can name it. So I'm going to call this, let's call this green. Or I'm going to ID it guac. So the ID is something, as you might have just guessed, that I can come up with. It can be anything. It could say something. It could be nonsense. It could be unrelated. Of course, we don't want that because we want our code to be clear and readable. So I'm going to ID my word avocados with guac. So now over here, instead of selecting all the list items, I can select my ID. And notice that I select my ID using a hashtag. So now that I have selected just the guac item, only the avocado item, the avocados item has been turned green. The rest of these have been left alone. So I could do this as much as I wanted. If I wanted to style my watermelon red, I could do ID, I'll just call this melon. And then I do hashtag melon, color red. So now the watermelon is red, the avocados are green. Jackfruit and mangoes are both orange though. So how am I going to do that? Remember I said that IDs are only for a single item. So I could come up with one ID for mango and one ID for jackfruit and write it twice in the code, but that's not very good. So there's actually something else we can use. This is called a class. So a class is really similar to an ID. The only real difference is that classes can be used on multiple items. So I could do class, I'm just going to call it class orange. I know that's not really consistent that that one's a color and the others aren't. Sorry, that's bothering my detail-oriented side, but I think we'll let it slip. So classes we select with a dot. So the hashtag is for IDs, classes are a dot. So now I can make the color orange. So now I've given these 4 items 3 different colors using IDs and classes. And what's really cool about classes is they can go on any different type of item. So both of these are on a list item right now. Let's say that I wanted to style my header orange too. I could go ahead and on my H3 say class equals orange. If I can not hit the caps lock, orange. And notice that this thing just automatically turned orange. So anything we wanted on the page, we could turn one of our spans orange if we wanted. I'm just going wild with this orange class. Ta-da! And this brings me to a great point, that there is actually a hierarchy here. So notice that this span has a couple different competing things going on. Up here in the code, I'm saying make it orange because of my orange class, but down here in the code, I'm saying make it pink. So there's some competition going on in our CSS. In one place, I'm saying to make it pink. In one place, I'm saying to make it orange. Notice that the orange won. That's because classes are ranked higher. So a class will override a element selector. So whatever I've said in the element styling, I can always override with a class. It turns out there's also a hierarchy between classes and IDs. So IDs are the highest ranked. Anything that's inside of an ID selector is going to be like the #1 thing that the code reads, and then it'll look for class styling, and then it'll look for elements. And this idea is not to be underestimated. You actually have a whole homework assignment dedicated to this idea, because this is one of the things that makes styling truly challenging, is once you get into a big production code base, you have a bunch of different lines of CSS saying competing things. And it's up to you as a developer to kind of explore which one is relevant. And in fact, I'm going to jump into our inspector here and see if we can see an example of that live in the real world. So up here, I pull out my inspector. And if I go to, actually, let me inspect a specific item. Okay, so here's an H1. Notice that if we go down here, we can see the styles on it. And notice that if I scroll down, there's a bunch of different styles that are crossed out. And just how complicated this is will hopefully illustrate my point, is that all these things that are crossed out are styles that are coming from somewhere in the code base that have been overwritten somewhere else. So it is really a tricky thing to start to figure out which styles go where. And there are tons of little rules that go along with it, but we're going to try and just introduce you to the basics of this hierarchy, and you can practice it in the homework. So going back to our pen, we can see that the first thing to know is that IDs get top priority, then classes, then element selectors. So I have a little diagram to break this down. So here is my diagram. We can see that we have our tag selector, which is the first thing I taught you. In HTML, it's just a regular tag. In CSS, we select based on the tag, and it is the third priority. Next, we have a class selector. Notice that our tag now has a class attribute. We select using a dot followed by the name of that class, and this is the second priority. The final one is the ID, which we have an ID attribute. In HTML, we use a hashtag in CSS, and it has priority 1. And by the way, this syntax stuff, really easy to not memorize the first few times you do this. So please Google for examples. I don't expect you to have this all memorized just by watching me teach it on a video. So Google away for the syntax. I don't want you guys wasting time on the homework, like racking your brain trying to remember exactly what I typed out. Beyond these priorities, things can get a little weird. You can start to combine things. For example, I could make this li.orange, which means it now only applies to LIs with the orange tag. I could put multiple things on it. So I could do, let's see, how do I do that? So if I had another class called, I'm going to put a class on jackfruit called delicious. And now if I do, oops. Now if I grab both of them, it will only select something with both these classes on them. So I'm just showing you a couple things you can do. If you guys are feeling bored tonight or this weekend, you can do some Googling and find out a million other ways to play with selectors. But for now, maybe just start with the things that I've gone over in this. So this selector thing is really key. It's how we create really subtle, dynamic web pages that actually are styled in really sophisticated ways. And as I mentioned, you will have a chance to play with this quite a bit in the homework tonight. So I just want to talk about a couple, that's really it for the coding tonight. I want to talk about a couple other things, and then I'll go through a little bit on each of the homework assignments, answer some questions, and then we are free to go for tonight. So, well, not free to go. I'm free to go. You guys are free to do the homework. Sorry about that. Okay, so I want to talk about just online resources one more time. I know I've said it like 4 times already, but like, please use MDN or any other resources you find. Don't expect yourself to have memorized the exact syntax just by being introduced to this a couple times. Use references online. They will make life so much easier. The next thing I want to talk about, which is kind of an aside, is the idea of frameworks. And I just want to mention this briefly. I'm not sure if frameworks were mentioned much in the lecture last night, so I'm just going to kind of start from the beginning and hopefully not give you information you already have. So to be totally honest, when we are writing CSS in the real world, we usually don't just write CSS. There are these other tools and frameworks that we use on top of CSS. So there's something called a preprocessor, which essentially lets us, I will summarize a preprocessor by saying that if we want to use the same color 80 different times in our code base, we can create a little variable so that we can easily swap that out. So preprocessor, things like less or Sass, they just make life easier. There's also things called frameworks, something like Bootstrap. And Bootstrap is actually the one that we use in Lambda School's main curriculum. These are tools that just add on top of CSS to make CSS even more sophisticated. So to be perfectly honest, trying to create the type of beautiful website you normally see online using just raw CSS would be really difficult. And so we're not trying to teach you something antiquated here by starting with raw CSS. It turns out that to use these tools, you really need to understand the basics first. But I just want to get you used to this idea so you know what people are talking about when they say frameworks or if someone says Bootstrap, and to give you a little preview of some of the skills you'll be learning in Lambda School's main curriculum. So we will not be going over any of those frameworks in this introduction course, but we will be laying the groundwork so that you can jump into them in the main curriculum and later in your career and write really beautiful, sophisticated websites using all these fancy tools. So a little plug for frameworks there. We'll talk a little bit more about frameworks with respect to JavaScript as we move forward. So the last thing I want to mention is the homework. So I will actually literally go over the homework, but before I do that, I want to talk about the structure of this course. So as you guys know, you have an opportunity to work live on the homework right after this lecture. And then after that, we have a stand-up where we get together and discuss it. So there's a tendency to kind of dip out before the stand-up. And, you know, if you're like dying of starvation and really need to go eat dinner, we understand. But if you just think it's not important, I want to urge you to reconsider. I think the stand-up is actually a really crucial part. One thing it can be kind of nice in an online class that you're sort of on your own and, you know, you don't have to see what other people are doing. I know it's a really vulnerable thing to learn programming, but it's also, I think, this really big downside of an online class is that you can't see that other people are struggling with the same things you are, or see that other people are asking questions that you would have never thought to ask, or being able to share your insights with others. Being able to actually come together and work on the homework together and discuss issues and questions is a really vital skill. And as an online class, we have to work extra hard to create that opportunity for you. So I would urge you to attend that stand-up. I think it's really valuable to be able to interact with your fellow students and see where everyone stands and what other people are struggling with. So I urge you to stay for the stand-up tonight. And of course, definitely to stay for the homework, because if you're not writing code, you definitely won't learn it. And on that note, let me show you the 3 assignments we have for you tonight. They will all be in CodePen. And as a little reminder, you will fork these over to your own CodePen. So there's a little fork. And then that's it. You have to save them, but there's no, excuse me. There's no uploading or turning them in. We already have your CodePen info, so we will be able to see them just by you forking them. So yay, technology. Okay, the first one is all about selectors. So in this one, you will be reading code. So over here in JavaScript, we have some questions. Just type directly in here, answer your questions within this commented out JavaScript thing. So you'll be trying to guess things like, what color is this header going to be? Just by looking at the code. So you'll be reading the HTML code and the CSS code and answering questions down here. At the end, you can delete line 1 and you'll be able to see if you're right or not. So the colors and style will all appear if you delete that comment. But do not delete it until you've given it an honest effort, or else you won't really learn. Reading code is actually a really important skill. So that's homework 1. The next one is a little bit of CSS styling. So we've written our instructions directly into the element. So this says red text header with a blue border. So the goal when you're done is to actually have this be red text with a blue border. You do not have to create any new selectors. We have created all the selectors you will need. You just have to write inside of them the pairs that you need to create the intended style. And it's not quite as simple as it seems at first because of things like classes and IDs. Our final assignment is a little more free form. We've given you just the very basic outline of a website for a business, and it's your job to write in the HTML and the CSS. So notice that we have all the requirements as well as the stretch goal up in the comment. So just start coding your HTML down here and your CSS in here. You can totally wipe what we have, or you can use it as a starting point, and just make sure you meet all the requirements specified here. So those are your 3 homework assignments to be completed in CodePen. And that is all I have to teach you. So let me answer some questions before we go. All right. So as far as a link to the homework, that will be, when you break out into your groups, that will be provided to you. Okay. As far as we have a question about the due date for the homework. That's a really good general question. So formally speaking, there's no specific due date. And because we're doing JavaScript for the rest of the lessons, it's not cumulative, so we won't build off of this. But I would urge you to try and do it as quickly as possible while it's still fresh. And if you are actually applying to Lambda School, you will need to complete the homework before you start Lambda School. So you will actually be given a due date to finish this course by the admissions department. So if you're not applying to Lambda School, which you should, then there's no due date. But if you are, you will be given a due date. Beyond that, it's a little self-paced, I'll admit. Most people do not finish the homework in the 2 weeks. It's a lot of information. So do as much as you can, and you can always come back and work on it later. We have some questions about groups. So unfortunately, that's not really my area of expertise since I don't monitor the group part, but if you can reach out to Thomas Dillard in Slack and he can help you out with that. So sorry, I don't have more information on that, but he is the person who can definitely help you on that one. All right, let's see, what else? So as far as going over the homework from last night, we will not be going over it. So that's another really good reason to attend the stand-up at the end, is because there's no formal homework review. So if you have a specific question on the homework, please ask it in Slack. But unfortunately, we don't really have the bandwidth to go over every single person's homework in detail. So if there's something you are wondering about, please ask about it in Slack. We'd love to clarify it. But beyond that, luckily, HTML is very visual. So you should be able to see it render. If it's rendering as expected on screen, that is a good sign. If it is not rendering as expected, you might want to ask some questions in Slack. As far as rewatching these recordings, we do put them on YouTube. I will say there's a little bit of a turnaround time because we have to load them out of Zoom and then upload them to YouTube. So unfortunately, it won't be immediately available. You can always look on YouTube for some of the videos from previous lessons if you want to go over that while you're working on the homework. I could find you the link for that if you need that. So yes, this video will be available on YouTube, but not immediately after this lesson. All right. We've got a few more questions coming in. As far as yes, directly after this lesson is homework time. So you don't do the homeworks in group. You'll be given the homework, and then you'll work on that on your own. And then directly after that, you actually go into your groups together to discuss the homework and ask any questions. Here's a admissions question about applying. So I'm going to kind of over answer this question for anyone else who's wondering about the application process. So you do not need to finish this course to apply for Lambda School. However, you do need to know some of the things we learn in this course. So for example, if you're coming into this pre-course or into this introduction course, and you already have some HTML, CSS, JavaScript knowledge, and you're just kind of brushing up and you feel ready to apply, I would reach out to Karen and start that process. So if you already feel ahead of the curve, now is a great time to apply. If you finish if you're a beginner, probably wouldn't apply yet. I would finish all 8 lessons. If you're feeling pretty good about the material and the lessons, but haven't totally finished the homework, you can still apply. So you do not need to finish the homework to apply, but you will need to finish the whole pre-course in order to attend. So for example, someone could apply and be accepted into Lambda School without ever having taken a single lesson in this course, if they had some outside knowledge. But they would have to actually finish it before they started. So hopefully that makes sense. Reach out to Karen Zachary in Slack if you want any more clarification on that. Okay, we have a kind of a specific question about actual coding, which is about the important tag. So there is something called the important tag somewhere in here, if I can find it. Yeah, can't find it. Oh, I think it's I never use the important tag because I'm sorry, who asked that question? Everything's getting buried. Sorry, don't know who asked the question about important, but there is something called important, which you can use to kind of overwrite this priority thing. So for example, if you decided that this should have priority, you could use important to overwrite it. Stay away from that though. It's like a shortcut that will create a million problems in the future. So I will confirm your suspicion that you should stay away from the important tag. It is kind of this cheap way to overwrite a sophisticated system that is just going to throw a wrench in your tire later. It is worth it to put in the work up front to understand the hierarchy and use the hierarchy in the appropriate way so that you actually have good, well-working CSS code. We have a question about, are you allowed to take this course more than once? Yes, you are, and lots of people actually do. So as I kind of hinted at, we teach you a ton. If you are a brand new to coder beginner, you're probably not going to get, I mean, I hate to say it, but you might not get everything you need out of the first 2 weeks. So what does that mean? It means maybe using outside resources, maybe taking the class again, maybe going over old videos. That's totally allowed. That's totally okay. The thing we don't like to see is if you've taken the course 3 times and you're not really improving and you're not really getting it, there are cases where we say, hey, maybe this isn't the right time for you to attend Lambda School. But if you're growing and you're stepping in the right direction and it's making more sense every time, take the class a couple times. It's always fun for me to see people a few times too. So don't feel weird about that. That's a lot of people do that. We have a question. I'm just going to take a couple more questions because I want you guys to have lots of time for homework. Just a couple questions about the full course. The first is the length. So the full course is 6 months and it's full time. That's Monday through Friday. And yeah, so it is 6 months. It actually, okay, let me clarify. It's a little longer than 6 months because we have breaks, but it's 6 months worth of material. So I think it ends up taking, depending on if you time it with a holiday or not, it can end up taking, closer to 7 months. However, if you are not able to attend full-time, there is a part-time course that runs in the evenings. And we only run that, that's a full year, but we only run that a couple times a year. So I don't have the exact date of when the next one starts. I think it's a little bit out. So the course is 6 months, give or take a little bit, unless you take the part-time one, which is a full year. As far as transferring from the full-time to the part-time, you would have to ask admissions about that. The timing might be a little weird because the part-time only runs every once in a while. I haven't heard about that working, but they might be able to work with you on that. So a great question for Karen. The material is exactly the same for the part-time and full-time. It's just different pacing. I personally do not instruct the full-time or part-time course. I only work part-time, so I just take care of this course. Occasionally, I will substitute on it. I wish I could teach it because there are so many fun topics, but I also am a musician and I need time to play music, so I do not teach it. So that's the short answer of that. Maybe in the future I will teach it though, who knows. And then there were some questions about languages taught in the full-time course. I mentioned that at the beginning. So we cover everything you need to know for web development. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and their frameworks. We cover Python and we cover C. Those are the languages you would see in the full-time or part-time course. So I love all the questions. It seems like a lot of the questions have to do not so much with coding, but with the course. I would keep asking those in Slack. Anything admissions related, ask Karen. And I am going to actually call it for tonight because I want you guys to have plenty of time to practice all these skills. So that is it for our lesson for tonight. We will be learning JavaScript tomorrow, so I will see you guys then. All right, have a great night. If I can figure out how to hang up the meeting. All right, I think I got it. All right, good night, you guys. I'll see you tomorrow.